Augusta Beckett boarded the westbound train at St. Louis on a Tuesday morning in April of 1878 with nothing but a leather trunk, a letter she had already read 37 times, and the absolute iron conviction that she would never love a man again as long as she drew breath upon this earth. The letter was from her mother. It said simply that her cousin Frances had taken ill in a small town called Dusty Creek, Nevada, and that someone needed to go and tend to her until she recovered. Augusta had volunteered before her mother had even finished reading the words aloud at the breakfast table, and the speed with which she had done so told everyone in the room exactly how desperate she was to leave Cincinnati behind. They did not speak the man's name in front of her anymore. They had learned better. His name was Carlisle Whitmore, and he had been Augusta's intended for 2.5 years. He had dark hair and smooth hands, and a way of speaking that made everything sound like a promise. He had also, it turned out, a wife already installed in a brownstone house in Philadelphia, a fact that Augusta had discovered not through any dramatic revelation, but through the quiet, humiliating mechanics of a letter sent to the wrong address. The letter had arrived at her mother's house by mistake. It had been addressed to Carlisle, written by his wife, full of ordinary domestic details: a leaking roof, a child's cough, a question about when he would next come home. Augusta had read it twice, set it on the mantelpiece, and gone upstairs to sit on the edge of her bed in perfect silence for 4 hours. She did not cry. She thought about crying and decided it was not worth the effort, which frightened her more than the tears would have. She had been 24 years old and already engaged and already done with men, and she had carried that resolution onto the westbound train like a second piece of luggage, heavier than the leather trunk and far more difficult to set down. The train journey from St. Louis to the Nevada Territory took 9 days in 1878, with 3 changes and a stretch of rough track through the Utah Territory that rattled the passenger cars so badly that Augusta's hairpins came loose, and her coffee went cold before she could finish it. She read 2 novels, played cards with an elderly preacher from Tennessee who cheated so badly she found it charming, and watched the landscape transform itself from the rolling green of Missouri into something wilder and more honest brown and red and gold, vast and indifferent and strange, cut through with rock formations that rose from the earth like sentences that had been left unfinished. She found herself pressing her forehead against the glass of the window and staring at it for long stretches. There was something in the rawness of it that she liked. It did not try to be pretty. It simply was what it was. Dusty Creek was not on any of the major rail lines. She took the last train to a junction town called Harlow Station and then arranged to hire passage on a supply wagon heading south. The wagon driver was a broad, sun-weathered woman named Della Prout who hauled dry goods and hardware to 4 different small towns on a route she had been running for 6 years, and who offered Augusta a ride in exchange for help unloading crates at each stop. Augusta accepted without hesitation. She had not come west to be delicate. "You got people in Dusty Creek?" Della asked as the wagon rolled out of Harlow Station into the open desert, the mules moving at their steady, unimpressed pace, beneath a sky that was so wide and so blue it seemed almost aggressive. "My cousin," Augusta said. "She is ill, fever," her last letter said. "Doc Henshaw is good," Della said. "Best you could hope for out here. He keeps folks alive that other doctors would have given up on months before." "That is reassuring." Della gave her a sideways look. "You're from back east, Cincinnati. What are you running from?" Augusta turned to look at the woman sharply. Della was watching the mules with perfect calm, as if she had simply asked what the weather was like back in Ohio. "I am not running from anything," Augusta said. "I am going towards something. There is a difference." "Is there?" Della said, and it was not a question, and she did not pursue it further, and Augusta liked her enormously for both of those things. The road to Dusty Creek was, as far as Augusta could determine, the only road. It ran south from the junction and then curved west through a low canyon, and then straightened again across a wide flat plain where the sage grew in silver-green clumps and the sky came all the way down to the ground at every horizon. There were no forks, no branches, no alternate routes. It was a single track of packed earth and wagon ruts, and it went exactly one place. They reached Dusty Creek on the second afternoon, just as the sun was beginning its long descent toward the western ridgeline, painting everything in shades of copper and amber that made even the dusty, false-fronted buildings along the main street look briefly magnificent. Augusta's cousin Frances was, in fact, recovering well. She had been through a bad bout of desert fever in March, and was now thin and pale and restless in her bed at the boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Caldwell, who was also thin and pale but in no way restless, and who moved through her establishment with the quiet authority of a person who has decided exactly what they will and will not tolerate and has not revisited the question since. "You didn't have to come all the way out here," Frances said when Augusta appeared in her doorway with her leather trunk, road dust on her skirt and her hair loosened from the journey. "I know," Augusta said. "I wanted to." Frances studied her for a moment with the particular attention of someone who has known you since you were both in pinafores. "Is it that man?" she asked. "His name is no longer relevant," Augusta said. Frances nodded slowly. She was 26, 2 years older than Augusta, and she had the good sense not to push. "Well," she said, "pull that chair over. Tell me about the train." Dusty Creek had approximately 300 residents in the spring of 1878. It had a general store, a livery stable, a blacksmith, a saloon called the Red Wheel, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, a small telegraph office, a barber shop, and Doc Henshaw's surgery, which was attached to the back of the barber shop by a shared wall and a door that the doctor used as a shortcut when he needed scissors. There was also a land office that served the surrounding ranches and homesteads, a small hotel in addition to Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house, and at the far southern edge of town, a freight operation run out of a large barn by a man named Homer Garrett. Augusta did not meet Homer Garrett for the first 4 days of her time in Dusty Creek. She was occupied with Frances, with learning where things were, with helping Mrs. Caldwell in the kitchen in exchange for a reduced rate on her room, and with the general project of adjusting herself to a place where the air smelled like sage and hot stone, and the nights were cold enough that she needed 2 blankets even in April. She met him on the 5th day at the general store, where she was purchasing ribbon and thread for Frances, who had taken it into her head to embroider a pillowcase as a form of convalescent entertainment. She came around the end of the dry goods aisle and walked directly into a man who was moving in the opposite direction with a coil of rope over one shoulder and a paper-wrapped bundle under his arm. And the collision was not violent, but it was thorough. The bundle went one way, the coil of rope swung, and Augusta's basket tipped and scattered its contents across the wooden floor. "I am sorry," he said immediately, crouching to collect the spilled items. "It was equally my fault," Augusta said, crouching at the same moment, and they came very close to hitting heads but did not, and found themselves for a brief moment at the same level, both of them reaching for the same spool of green thread. He was looking at her. She was looking at him. He had dark brown eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same material as the canyon walls she had passed through on the road in, and there was a scar along his left cheekbone, thin and old and silver in the afternoon light, and he was not what she would have called classically handsome, but there was something in his face that arrested her attention in a way she had not anticipated and found immediately inconvenient. "Homer Garrett," he said, and held out his hand. He was perhaps 29 or 30, with the kind of leanness that comes from genuine physical work rather than fashion, and his handshake was careful and brief. "Augusta Beckett," she said. "You're Frances Abbott's cousin. I heard you'd come. News travels. It's a small town," he said simply, and handed her the green thread and stood up, and that was the entirety of their first meeting. She thought about it twice before she went asleep that night and then told herself firmly to stop. The problem with small towns, Augusta discovered over the following week, was that they made it structurally impossible to avoid anyone. She ran into Homer Garrett at the post office, where he was receiving a shipment of documents, and she was sending a letter home to her mother. She ran into him at the Red Wheel Saloon, where she had gone to ask the proprietor, a cheerful man named Hicks, whether he might know of any sewing work she could take on to occupy her time and supplement her modest travel funds. She ran into him at the livery stable, where she had gone to pat the horses because she missed the horses her father had kept before he passed, 3 years previous, and because being near horses made her feel calmer in a way that was difficult to explain but entirely reliable. Homer Garrett was at the livery stable for legitimate reasons. He ran a freighting operation, and his animals were his business. And he found her standing at the stall of a gray mare called Patience, and talking to the horse in a low, even voice about the philosophical question of whether contentment was something you arrived at or something you built. He stood in the doorway of the stable for a moment without announcing himself, and when she heard his boot on the straw and turned, he said, without any embarrassment at having listened, "I leaned toward building personally." "You were eavesdropping," she said. "The mare seemed engaged. I didn't want to interrupt." He said it completely without guile, and Augusta found that she could not produce any genuine offense. She turned back to the horse. "She is a very good listener," she said. "She is," he agreed, and came in and checked the mare's water trough and then checked his other animals, and they moved around each other in the stable with a kind of accidental ease that Augusta noticed and distrusted because she had not come west for ease. She had come west to be alone with purpose, but the ease persisted. It persisted through the following 2 weeks as April moved into May, and Frances continued to recover, and Augusta found herself more embedded in the life of Dusty Creek than she had expected. She had taken on the sewing work small things, repairs, hemming, the occasional dress for one of the ranchers' wives who came into town on Saturdays, and she had found in it a rhythm she could live inside. Mrs. Caldwell was teaching her to make proper bread in a wood-fired oven, a project that required both patience and a willingness to fail repeatedly before succeeding. She had learned the names of most of the town's residents. She had developed a habit of walking to the edge of town in the early evenings to watch the light change on the desert, which changed every single evening and never in the same way twice. Homer Garrett's freighting operation ran supply routes to 4 surrounding ranches and 2 mining camps in the hills to the east. He employed 2 men, a wiry young man named Tobias who was 19 and deeply enthusiastic about everything, and an older man named Creed who spoke rarely and with tremendous economy, and who seemed to find Tobias's enthusiasm both baffling and faintly amusing. Homer himself drove one of the 3 wagons when the route required it, handled the accounts, negotiated contracts with the ranchers, and managed the barn and its animals with a methodical attentiveness that Augusta, who had grown up watching her father run his dry goods business in Cincinnati, recognized as the particular quality of someone who genuinely cared about the thing they were building. She learned these things gradually, through conversation that accumulated in small increments, a few sentences at the stable, a brief exchange outside the general store, one long Sunday afternoon when it rained, which it almost never did, and several of Dusty Creek's residents found themselves sheltering on the covered porch of the general store waiting for the weather to pass. There were 5 of them on that porch: Augusta, Homer, Della Prout, who had come back through on her supply route, an old rancher named Bert who was approximately 1,000 years old and claimed to have met Jim Bridger personally, and a young Mexican woman named Esperanza who worked as a seamstress, and who had, over the past 2 weeks, become the closest thing Augusta had to a friend in Dusty Creek. Bert told stories for most of the afternoon. Some of them were plausible, and some were not, and all of them were entertaining. Della contributed her own observations about road conditions and what she had heard at various stops along her route. Esperanza and Augusta sat together on a bench and talked about thread counts and the particular difficulty of working with silk in dry climates, which Augusta had not previously needed to consider. Homer sat on a crate at the end of the porch and said relatively little but listened with the kind of focused attention that Augusta had begun to notice was characteristic of him. He was not a quiet man because he had nothing to say, but because he was genuinely more interested in what other people had to say than in the sound of his own voice, which was, in Augusta's experience, an exceptionally rare quality. At one point the rain intensified briefly and Bert's hat blew off the porch rail and down into the muddy street, and Homer went out into the rain to retrieve it without being asked, and came back with his shirt wet across the shoulders, and Augusta found herself watching the way the water had darkened the fabric and then looked away with more force than the situation strictly required. "You're fighting something," Esperanza said quietly beside her. "I am not fighting anything," Augusta said. Esperanza raised her eyebrows in exactly the way Della had looked at her on the wagon road, that same gentle, unconvinced expression, and said nothing further, and Augusta thought that the women of the Nevada Territory had collectively developed some kind of perception that the women of Cincinnati had not been offered. The particular event that changed things between Augusta and Homer, or rather, that brought to the surface what was already changing, happened on a Wednesday in the middle of May, on the road between Dusty Creek and the Hargrove Ranch, which was the largest of Homer's client spreads and sat about 12 miles north of town. Augusta had agreed to accompany Homer and Tobias on that day's delivery run because the rancher's wife, a formidable woman named Clara Hargrove, who had been married 22 years and had 4 grown children and opinions about everything, had asked specifically for Augusta to come out and look at some curtains she wanted altered. Esperanza was occupied with another commission. Augusta was not. She had said yes before she thought it through. She sat on the wagon bench beside Homer while Tobias rode alongside on a brown gelding named Captain, and the road north wound through terrain that was different from the road she had arrived on. More color here, red earth and black rock, with occasional stands of juniper, and the distant blue mass of the mountains to the northwest holding snow still on their highest reaches. For the first few miles they talked about practical things, how long the Hargrove run usually took, whether Clara Hargrove was as demanding as her reputation suggested she was, Homer confirmed, but fair, which he considered the important part, the particular repair Tobias had made to one of the wagon wheels that morning. Then a comfortable silence settled that was not uncomfortable at all, which was the second type Augusta recognized, and the type she found more dangerous. "You haven't said how long you're staying," Homer said eventually. He was watching the mules and his voice was entirely conversational. "I haven't decided," Augusta said. "Frances is near recovered. She is." "So you're staying for other reasons now?" Augusta looked at the mountains. "I suppose I am," she said. He did not follow this and she was grateful. The wagon moved steadily. The juniper smell was clean and sharp in the warm air. "You came from Cincinnati," he said. "You and your cousin both, though she's been here 3 years now." "That is correct. Long way to come." "People come west for all kinds of reasons," she said, and put enough evenness into her voice that it would have deterred a more aggressive line of inquiry. Homer simply nodded as if she had said something entirely ordinary. "They do," he agreed. "I came west from Virginia at 22. Took a job driving a supply wagon for a mining outfit up in the hills and liked it enough to stay." "Do you have family in Virginia?" she asked, because it seemed only fair to match him question for question. "A brother," he said. "Thomas, he farms, we write." He paused. "Our parents passed some years back, fever. I am sorry." "It was a while ago," he said, simply and without deflection, the way people say things when they have genuinely made peace with them rather than just learned to suppress them. "You said your father had horses." She looked at him. "At the stable, you heard me tell Patience." "I told you." She was engaged. I didn't want to interrupt. Augusta surprised herself by laughing. It was a real laugh, not a polite one, and it came out before she had time to manage it, and Homer glanced at her with something in his expression that she could not fully catalog, something warm and careful at the same time. "He had 3 horses," she said. "He died 3 years ago, My mother still lives in the house on Elm Street with my two younger brothers. They are managing. And you were managing too, he said, until you came west. It was not quite a question, and it was not intrusive, and it was also exactly accurate. And Augusta sat with it for a moment while the wagon rolled north, and Tobias up ahead broke into a short piece of song, and then abandoned it. I was managing the way a person manages when they build a wall around what they cannot look at directly, she said. She did not know why she said it. She did not generally say things like that to people she had known for 3 weeks. Homer was quiet for a long moment. That is a particular kind of tired, he said. Yes, she said, it is. He did not ask what was behind the wall, she did not offer it. But something had shifted between them with the quality of a key turning in a lock, not opening the door but making the action available. Clara Hargrove's curtains required 2 hours of careful work. The woman herself was exactly as advertised, brisk, specific, and fundamentally reasonable, with a rancher's practical respect for competence and a rancher's wife's particular attention to the details of domestic life in a place that required a great deal of effort to make livable. She served Augusta coffee and pie that was exceptional and asked about Cincinnati and Augusta's family with direct curiosity unmediated by social performance, and Augusta found her both exhausting and refreshing. The ranch itself was substantial and well-maintained, with a kitchen garden and a small orchard and corrals holding good horses. The Hargroves had built something solid in this landscape, and looking at it, Augusta felt the first genuine stirring of something she could only call possibility. The sense that a life could be constructed here, that the desert was not merely raw material for endurance, but also for something more permanent. She thought about this on the drive back to town. The sun had moved to the west, and the light was long and golden, and the mountains held it differently than they had in the morning, with more purple in the shadow and more warmth on the stone. Homer drove and said nothing for several miles, and the silence was, Augusta decided, one of the finest she had been inside in a considerable time. "Mr. Garrett," she said eventually. "Homer," he said. She had been calling him Mr. Garrett for 3 weeks, and he had not said this before, and the shift in it was small and consequential simultaneously. "Homer," she said, trying the name, and he looked at her briefly with that warm and careful expression. "The ranch," she said. "The Hargrove Ranch." "How long did it take them to build it to that?" 15 years, he said. "Started with a tent and a water claim in 1863. Clara told me herself." 15 years, Augusta said. "The desert takes time," he said, "but it keeps what you give it." She turned the phrase over in her mind. The desert keeps what you give it. It was not the kind of thing people said in Cincinnati, where the landscape was already established and the question was never whether you could make something grow, but only which variety you preferred. Francis was, by the 3rd week of May, well enough to sit on the boarding house porch for several hours each day, to take meals downstairs with the other boarders, and to resume her correspondence with a range of people who had, she said, been entirely too worried about her. She was also, being Francis, fully observant of everything happening around her and quite willing to comment on it. "You've been helping at Homer Garrett's barn," she said one evening when Augusta came back with straw on her skirt, and the specific kind of calm face Augusta wore when she was actively working to appear neutral. "Patience threw a shoe," Augusta said. "I happened to be there and helped hold her while Tobias handled the replacement. You happened to be there at 7 in the evening." "I enjoy the evening light." Francis smiled at her embroidery. "He is a very good man," she said. "I have known him by reputation for 3 years and by acquaintance since February, when he brought supplies here in a blizzard because Mrs. Caldwell's regular order was late and he knew she had boarders to feed." Augusta sat down in the chair beside her cousin. "He did not tell me that." "He would not," Francis said. "He is not the kind of man who tells you about the good things he does. He simply does them and moves on." Augusta looked out at the street where the last of the day's traffic was settling, a rider going south, a woman calling a child inside from the porch of the laundry. "Francis," she said. "I'm not saying anything," Frances said mildly. You are absolutely saying something. I am embroidering a pillowcase, Frances said, and observing that the woman I love most in the world, who came out here because her heart was broken by a man who lied to her, seems for the first time in a long time to not be spending all of her energy building walls. I find that interesting. That is all I am saying. Augusta was quiet. Down the street, the Red Wheels piano had started up, something slow and a little mournful. The sky above the roof lines was going dark blue at its top edge, with the last pale gold at the horizon. I am afraid, Augusta said, which was the truest thing she had said to anyone in months, and she said it quietly and looked at her hands. I know, Frances said. That is also why you came west, to be somewhere big enough that the fear did not take up all the room. Augusta considered this for a long time. You are very perceptive for someone who has been ill, she said. Illness gives you a great deal of time to think, Frances said. The thing about being afraid was that it did not disappear simply because you named it. Augusta knew this. She had been afraid of plenty of things in her life. Her father's long illness, the particular vulnerability of loving someone, the way Carlyle's letter had rearranged everything she thought she knew about her own judgment. Naming the fear did not dissolve it. But Frances was right that there was something different about being afraid here, in this vast open landscape, than being afraid inside the furnished rooms of her mother's house in Cincinnati. Here the fear was proportional to its surroundings. Here it was one small thing among many large things rather than the largest thing in a small space. She let this sit with her over the following days and found that it shifted something. She began, in small increments, to stop maintaining quite such a careful distance. She stopped finding reasons to end conversations with Homer before they grew comfortable. She stopped treating the warmth she felt in his company as a problem requiring management. They began to talk in earnest, about many things, about Virginia, which Homer described with the particular mixed affection of someone who loved a place and also understood exactly why they had needed to leave it. About Cincinnati, which Augusta found she could describe without the usual heaviness, because here, from sufficient distance, it looked simply like one place among many rather than the only possible context for her life. About books, Homer had a shelf of them in the office attached to his barn, worn and well-read, and Augusta found him reading one evening when she stopped by to check on patients, and they spent an hour discussing the merits of Washington Irving with a mutual enthusiasm that surprised them both. About the desert and what made it beautiful, and why beauty in austere places felt more trustworthy somehow than beauty in comfortable ones. About work, and what it meant to build something that was genuinely yours. About loneliness, which they discussed carefully and obliquely but discussed. There was an evening in early June when they walked to the edge of town together, not quite by plan. She had been going for her habitual evening walk. He had been returning from a client meeting at the land office, and they had fallen into step together on the same road, which was, after all, the only road, and had gone to the end of it together where the town gave way to the open desert. The sun was setting directly ahead of them, enormous and molten, and the sky was doing what the Nevada sky did in June evenings, filling itself with color from the horizon upward, pink and orange, and a deep, impossible rose at the very top where the blue of day was still holding on. I have never seen anything like that in my life, Augusta said, looking at it. She said it not as a performance but as a simple fact. I know, Homer said. He was standing close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the familiar smell of horses and cedar, and whatever soap he used, clean and unshowy. I have seen it 500 times and I still say the same thing. She looked at him instead of the sunset. He was watching the sky with the same open attention he gave to everything, not performing appreciation but actually feeling it. And she thought, with sudden and total clarity, that this was a man who moved through the world with his eyes genuinely open, who had not built walls around the things that mattered to him but had instead just decided, at some point, to bear the risk of caring about them. She thought about Carlyle, briefly and without the usual pain. She thought about what he had been, charming and certain and entirely constructed, a performance of a man rather than an actual one. She thought about the 2.5 years she had spent mistaking the performance for the real thing and how that mistake had felt like a verdict on her judgment rather than merely an error. She thought about how long she had been building the wall. "Homer," she said. He turned from the sunset and looked at her. "Yes. I came out here because a man I was engaged to turned out to already have a wife in Philadelphia," she said. "I have not told anyone that clearly. My cousin knows it. My family knows it. But I haven't said it plainly to another person since it happened." He was entirely still. He was not making a face of shock or sympathy or any of the other expressions that people arrange themselves into when you told them something difficult. He was just listening. "I had decided," she said, "that it meant I was not capable of good judgment about men, that whatever it was in me that had believed him was defective and could not be trusted." "That is a significant thing to decide about yourself," he said carefully. "It is," she said. "I am no longer certain it is accurate." He was quiet for a moment. The last edge of the sun was dipping below the horizon, and the colors in the sky were shifting toward something deeper. "What changed your assessment?" he asked, and his voice was careful, but there was something alive in it. Augusta looked at him steadily. "You," she said, "largely." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight and texture. Homer looked at her with an expression that was, for once, not careful at all. It was direct and warm and a little wondering, as if she had said something he had not permitted himself to expect. "I am not a complicated man," he said slowly. "I have a barn and 3 wagons and a good pair of mules and a shelf of books and some money in a savings account at the bank in Harlow Station, and I work most days and sleep well at night, and I have not found a reason in 7 years to go back to Virginia. I am also not a man who has ever told a woman anything that wasn't true." "I know that," she said. "How do you know that?" "Because you told me about Patience's shoe after a week of knowing me, and it was a very dull story, and a man who was constructing himself for my benefit would never have told me a dull story," she said. "He would have told me something impressive." Homer's mouth changed. It changed into a smile that was slow and genuine and reached all the way to his dark brown eyes, and it transformed his face into something that made Augusta's heart conduct itself in a manner that she decided, for the first time in a very long time, she was not going to argue with. "A dull story about a horseshoe," he said. "It was very dull," she said. "I found it deeply reassuring." He laughed, which was a sound she had not heard from him in full before, low and warm and unguarded, and she laughed too, and they stood at the end of the only road in the deepening dusk, and the colors of the sky turned above them into something that had no name in any language she knew. He did not try to kiss her that evening. She noticed this and found it right. He walked her back to Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house and said good night at the gate with a simplicity and dignity that felt, given everything she had learned to recognize as honest, entirely genuine, and she went up to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall for a while, but not in the way she had stared at the wall in Cincinnati after reading the letter from Carlyle's wife. This was different. This was the staring of someone who has opened a door they had kept closed for a long time and is now simply letting their eyes adjust to the new light. The next significant thing that happened, which Augusta later thought of as the thing that made everything irreversible, was an argument. It began with the question of whether she intended to stay in Dusty Creek, which was raised not by Homer, but by a man named Gerald Ashe, who was a land speculator from San Francisco passing through on his way to a mining claim in the hills, and who appeared at Mrs. Caldwell's dining table for 3 consecutive evenings, and who had the kind of polished confidence that Augusta had once found attractive and now found faintly exhausting. Gerald Ashe had decided that Augusta Beckett was exactly the kind of woman who needed to be talked into staying west, and that he was exactly the kind of man to do the talking, and he pursued this project with a persistence that started as mildly amusing and became steadily less so. He was not aggressive or inappropriate. He was simply entirely convinced of his own charm, and therefore unresponsive to signals that it was not having the intended effect. He told her about opportunities in San Francisco. He suggested that a woman of her qualities was wasted in a small desert town. He said the word wasted twice in one evening, and Augusta, who had by that point eaten enough of Mrs. Caldwell's bread to feel confident and grounded, found that she had run out of patience. "I am not wasted anywhere I choose to be," she said pleasantly, and Gerald Ashe looked startled and then attempted a recovery that was not successful. Homer had heard about Gerald Ashe's three-evening campaign through the small-town information network that transmitted such things with remarkable efficiency. And when Augusta appeared at the barn the following morning, she found him occupied with a saddle repair, and unusually quiet in a way that was not his normal comfortable quiet. She stood at Patience's stall for a moment, and then turned to look at him. "You heard about the man from San Francisco," she said. "Hicks told me," he said. "Are you angry?" He looked up from the saddle. "No," he said with the particular precision of someone who has examined the feeling carefully before reporting it. "I am not angry, I am—" He stopped. "Worried," she supplied. He set down the awl he was using. "I don't have any right to be worried," he said. "You are a free woman and you have made no promises to me and I have made no—" He stopped again. "Homer," she said. "I don't want to misread something," he said, and the careful quality of his voice was more revealing than the words themselves, because underneath it she could hear something that was not careful at all. She crossed the distance between them, which was perhaps 10 feet of clean straw, and stopped 2 feet away from him and looked at him directly. He was looking back at her with those dark brown eyes that were trying very hard to be neutral. "You are not misreading anything," she said. The careful quality dissolved. Not dramatically. Homer Garrett did not do things dramatically, but simply and quietly, the way a held breath releases. He looked at her for a long moment, and then raised one hand and pushed a strand of hair back from her face where it had come loose in the morning wind. Just that, the lightest and most deliberate touch, and Augusta felt it go all the way through her like a clear note struck on a quiet afternoon. "I have been thinking about asking if I might court you properly," he said. "I have been uncertain whether that was appropriate given that you came west under particular circumstances and may not intend to stay." "Ask," she said. "Augusta," he said, "would you allow me to court you properly?" "Yes," she said, "I would." He smiled again, that slow, genuine smile, and she thought that she had perhaps never in her life been quite this certain of anything at quite the right time. Courting in Dusty Creek in 1878 was conducted within a set of social conventions that were somewhat more relaxed than those Augusta had grown up with in Cincinnati. The frontier, by necessity, had adjusted certain formalities, but it was still a recognized social arrangement with its own form and meaning. Homer came to Mrs. Caldwell's in the evenings twice a week, and they sat on the porch, which Mrs. Caldwell observed from the parlor window with an air of determined nonchalance. He brought small things. Once a book he thought she would like, once a small bunch of wildflowers he had found on the North Road, once a piece of rose quartz he had picked up from the ground near the eastern hills, because he said the color of it had made him think of the morning sky on certain days, which was such a precise and unaffected observation that Augusta had to concentrate very hard on remaining composed. He took her riding on Saturday mornings when his work schedule permitted. She rode Patience, who was both steady and opinionated, and who Augusta had developed a genuine relationship with over 2 months of regular conversations. Homer rode a bay horse named Meridian who had opinions of his own, and they rode north and east of town into the desert proper, away from the road, into terrain that required attention and offered in return an extraordinary quality of openness, the sense of being held by the landscape rather than confined by it. He was teaching her about what she was looking at, not in a way that was condescending, but in the way of a person sharing something they love with someone they believe capable of loving it equally. The difference between the types of sage, the names of the various rock formations, and what the colors of the strata told you about the geological history. How to read the signs of water in the desert, because water in the desert was the thing that organized everything else, the thing around which all other life and settlement arranged itself. "Your whole operation is essentially about water," she said one morning, watching him explain why the northern ranch route took the particular path it did, always arcing toward the low ground where the catchments were. "Everything out here is about water," he said. "You learn that first and then everything else follows from it." "What else did you learn first when you came west?" He thought about this with the genuine consideration he gave to questions he found worth answering. "That the land doesn't care about you," he said. "In Virginia we had land that had been farmed and managed for 100 years, and it felt like it wanted to be useful. Out here the land doesn't want anything. It just is. And until you make your peace with that, until you stop expecting it to accommodate you, you spend all your energy fighting it. And after you make peace with it, then it's the most honest company you've ever kept," he said. Augusta looked at the desert around her, the silver sage and the red earth and the stone ridgelines in the middle distance. "I think I understand that," she said. He looked at her with quiet attention. "I think you do," he said. She told him about Carlisle on a Saturday morning in mid-June, out in the desert, walking the horses along a dry stream bed. She told it plainly and without drama, simply the sequence of events. The engagement, the letter arriving, what she had found in it, the 4 hours on the edge of her bed, the decision she had made about herself and her judgment, the westbound train. She did not make it a story of suffering. She made it a story about being wrong about something and having to live inside that wrongness for a while. Homer listened without interruption. When she finished, there was a long moment where they walked the horses in the sandy bed, and the morning light came off the stone walls above them with a warmth that held everything in amber. "He was a fool," Homer said then simply. Augusta looked at him. "I was a fool," she said. "I did not see it." "You were deceived by someone who worked very hard to deceive you," he said. "That is not the same as being a fool. That is being a person who trusted someone who did not deserve it." "My judgment, your judgment brought you west," he said. "It brought you to this town and to a gray mare named Patience and to a conversation at the end of the only road in the county. I find your judgment fairly sound." Augusta considered several different responses and discarded all of them in favor of looking at him for a long moment in the amber light. "Homer," she said, "I am very glad I came west." "So am I," he said. And the simplicity of it and the directness and the absolute lack of performance were everything she had learned in 2 months to recognize as the particular signature of this particular man. And she thought about what it felt like to be certain. Not the false certainty she had felt with Carlisle, which had been a kind of anesthetic, numbing her enough that she could not feel the questions underneath, but a real certainty, built of evidence and attention and time. She reached across the gap between their horses and took his hand, which required a small, awkward adjustment that made Patience shift sideways. And Homer steadied his horse and looked at their joined hands, and then at her, with an expression of such uncomplicated happiness that Augusta felt something in the vicinity of her chest rearrange itself into a configuration she suspected might be permanent. They rode back to town holding hands for approximately 20 yards before it became too complicated for the terrain, and they were laughing when they reached the stable, and Tobias saw them and said nothing but war for the remainder of the day, an expression of profound personal satisfaction that he had absolutely no talent for concealing. July came and the heat with it. A dry, enveloping heat that turned the desert floor into something that shimmered and seemed to breathe. And Augusta had by then so thoroughly revised her initial resignation about staying in Dusty Creek that she could not quite remember the architecture of the person who had boarded the train in St. Louis with a closed and certain heart. Frances was fully recovered and had resumed her work as a schoolteacher in the stone building at the edge of town that served as a schoolhouse from August through May, and she was watching her cousin's transformation with an expression of deep and private satisfaction that she maintained the courtesy not to remark upon too directly. Augusta had acquired over the summer months a set of circumstances that resembled, more closely than she had expected, something like a life. Her sewing work had grown by word of mouth into a modest but real income. Esperanza had suggested that they might collaborate on a small dressmaking operation, Esperanza doing the major construction, Augusta doing the detailed finish work and alterations. And they had begun this tentatively in June, and had by July 3 steady clients and the beginning of a reputation in the surrounding ranch community. She had found that she loved this desert. She had found it with the particular surprise of someone who expected only to survive a place and instead found themselves genuinely possessed by it. The light at different hours. The quality of the silence, which was not empty but full of wind and bird song and the sound of distance, which had its own sound if you learned to hear it. The way the seasons moved here, not through the familiar green and brown of Ohio but through heat and color, and the angle of the sun against stone. She was happy. Not the performing of happiness, not the managed contentment she had practiced for 2 years in Cincinnati while building her wall, but the actual thing, warm and surprising and without any edge of performance to it. And Homer was the largest part of it, and she had stopped pretending otherwise. He had begun in July to talk about the future with the careful but unmistakable intention of a man who is building something in his mind and wants to know whether the person he is talking to is building the same thing. He talked about the expansion of the freighting operation, whether there was sufficient demand to add a 4th wagon and hire another driver. He talked about land north of town that could be had for a reasonable price and would be appropriate for a permanent structure. He talked about these things not in the abstract but specifically, with details and numbers and plans, and always in conversation with her, always as if her perspective on the viability of the thing was material. She understood what he was doing and she let him do it, and she contributed her own perspective with equal specificity, because she had decided that this was a person with whom she could be genuinely direct, and that directness was not a risk here but a gift that would be received as such. He took her to see the land one Sunday afternoon in late July. It was a stretch of flat ground behind a low rise about 1.5 miles north of town, with a creek running along its eastern boundary that held water in all seasons. He had checked this carefully before bringing her, and a view from the rise that encompassed the full sweep of the valley with the mountains on 3 sides, blue and changeable in the heat. They stood on the rise and looked at it together for a long time. The afternoon heat was steady and dry, and the creek below made a small sound that was very clean in all that space. "I could build something here that would last," Homer said, and his voice was even but there was something underneath it that was waiting. "I know," Augusta said. He turned to her. He was backlit by the afternoon sun and she could see the scar on his cheekbone and the careful hope in his eyes that he was not quite concealing. "Augusta," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that there is no right answer required of you, and whatever your answer is I will respect it completely." "Ask," she said. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "Not because you need to, and not because the town expects it, and not because of convention, but because I believe we could build something together that neither of us could build alone, and because you are the finest company I have ever kept, and because I love you, which I have been aware of for some weeks now and have been attempting to say in the right way." He paused. "That is the right way," he said, "which is just to say it." Augusta looked at him in the afternoon light. She thought about the train from St. Louis. She thought about the only road and where it had ended. She thought about 4 hours on the edge of a bed in Cincinnati with a dead certainty about her own defectiveness, and she thought about what it felt like to have been wrong about that, completely and magnificently wrong, and she thought that of all the things she had expected to find in Nevada she had not expected this, and she was so profoundly glad she had come. "Yes," she said. "Homer, yes." He crossed the space between them in 2 steps and took both of her hands in his and looked at her with that expression of uncomplicated happiness. And then he kissed her, which was unhurried and certain, and tasted like the desert afternoon, like dust and warmth and sage. and she kissed him back with her whole self, and thought that this was what it felt like to step through a door rather than to stand at the wall. They stood on the rise above the land that would become theirs, with the mountains around them on three sides and the creek below, and the wide Nevada sky above. And Augusta thought that the desert kept what you gave it, and she thought that she had given it everything she had, fear and walls and the long journey and the willingness to be wrong, and the desert had given it all back to her transformed. The wedding was in September. They planned it for September because that was when Francis said the weather would be perfect, which it was, warm still but without the full fury of the summer heat, with a quality of clarity in the air that made everything sharp-edged and beautiful in a way that Augusta associated with new beginnings. The ceremony was held in the church building on a Thursday afternoon because Reverend Caldwell, who was Mrs. Caldwell's husband and conducted services on Sundays, was available and willing on a Thursday, and had told them that the building had better light on Thursday afternoons, which Augusta took as evidence of sound aesthetic judgment. The whole of Dusty Creek attended more or less, insofar as a town of 300 people can attend a single event in a church that held 70 comfortably, which it managed by the creative employment of the porch, the open windows, and a general willingness to stand. Della Pruitt had timed her supply route to coincide. Clara Hargrove and her husband came down from the ranch, and Clara wore a hat with a green feather that was the finest hat Augusta had seen in the Nevada territory. Tobias cried openly and without any apparent embarrassment. Creed shook Homer's hand before the ceremony with so much evident feeling that it required the shaking of both hands and a long pause. Francis stood beside Augusta and held the flowers, wildflowers from the desert, silver and gold and pale purple, gathered that morning, and looked at her cousin with an expression of absolute uncomplicated love. Esperanza had made Augusta's dress from a bolt of ivory silk that had arrived via Della's wagon 2 weeks before, just barely on time, constructed with the skill and artistry that was Esperanza's particular gift, simply cut and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when the maker has understood exactly what is required and done it without excess. Homer was standing at the front of the church when she came in, and he turned when she appeared at the door and looked at her with an expression she had come to know in all its variations, the open warmth of a man who was not protecting himself from feeling anything. And she walked toward him through the midsummer light and the rows of dusty Nevadans standing in respectful attention, and thought that she had never in her life been more precisely where she was supposed to be. The ceremony was short and direct, which suited them both. The Reverend Caldwell had a good instinct for the important words and no habit of padding them. When he reached the vows, Homer said his in a voice that was quiet but carried easily in the space, each word deliberate and unhurried. Augusta said hers looking directly at him, and meant every syllable with a clarity she felt in her chest and her hands and the specific warmth of the afternoon sun coming through the window glass. The ring was gold and plain with a small turquoise stone the color of the desert sky, and Homer had ordered it specially from a jeweler in Harlow Station, and it fit as if it had been measured, which it had, with a piece of string she had not realized she was participating in the measuring for until Esperanza, who had been the unwitting accomplice, told her afterward and laughed. They were married, and then they went outside into the September afternoon, which received them with its clarity and warmth and the smell of sage on the air, and the town of Dusty Creek offered its congratulations in the direct and generous way of a community that has watched two of its members find each other and is collectively pleased about it. The celebration was at the Red Wheel Saloon, which Hicks had cleared and decorated with admirable enthusiasm, and whose piano player, a young man named Petrie, played for 3 hours without repeating himself. Della danced with Bert the ancient rancher, who it turned out was still a capable dancer, and Tobias danced with Esperanza, both of them laughing too hard to be graceful, and Clara Hargrove danced with her husband in the particular way of people who have been married 22 years and know exactly how to move together. Augusta danced with Homer in the middle of it all, and she put her head against his shoulder, and he held her with the quiet certainty that was particular to him. And she thought about the westbound train and the desert and the road with only one direction and the man who had been at the end of it. And she thought that the whole journey, from the letter on the mantelpiece to this moment, made a kind of sense that she could not have seen from inside any individual part of it, but could see clearly now from the inside of it all. The land north of town was purchased before the wedding. The house was started in October, when the main heat had passed, and the building season was brief but sufficient for the framing and roofing that would let them close it in before winter. Homer had planned it with a thoroughness that reflected his nature. He had drawn the layout himself, consulted with the 2 carpenters in Dusty Creek and a third brought out from Harlow Station, and he had asked Augusta about every decision that involved the interior of it, because it was her home as much as his, and he had no interest in building something without her opinion. She had opinions. She had always had opinions. She had simply been in a context for some years where expressing them fully had felt complicated. Here it did not feel complicated at all. She wanted a large kitchen because she had discovered that cooking was something she was good at and that she found genuinely satisfying, a revelation that had arrived via Mrs. Caldwell's bread lessons. She wanted windows on the north and east sides for the morning light. She wanted a bookshelf in whatever room served as a parlor that was built into the wall and not merely set against it, which Homer agreed was the better construction, and went out and arranged immediately. The house was framed and roofed by November and substantially finished by December, and they moved into it on the 22nd of December, 1878, in a cold that was entirely different from Ohio, winter cold, drier and more honest, the kind of cold that did not feel malicious but merely absolute, the desert being as fully itself in winter as in summer. They had a wood stove in the kitchen and a fireplace in the parlor, and the bookshelf was built into the wall exactly as planned, and the morning light came through the east windows at an angle that made the wood floor glow warm and gold from 7 until 9, and Augusta had never loved a house in her life the way she loved this one, and she told Homer so, and he said he felt the same, and they stood together in the kitchen on the first morning with coffee and watched the light move. Frances came for Christmas. She stayed a week and slept in the second bedroom and ate Augusta's, cooking with an appreciation that was deeply satisfying to provide. On Christmas Eve, the 4 of them, Homer, Augusta, Frances, and Esperanza, who had no family in town and whom Augusta had simply instructed to come, sat in the parlor with a fire and played cards and talked about everything and nothing. And Frances told stories about her students that were so funny that Augusta cried from laughing. And Homer won every game of cards with a placid efficiency that suggested he had been playing cards seriously since childhood, which he confirmed when asked. After Frances went home and the new year came, Augusta found herself settled into the particular rhythm of a life that was genuinely hers. The dressmaking business with Esperanza had continued to grow through the fall and into the winter, as word spread through the ranch community, and eventually to Harlow Station, where 3 women had ordered dresses by correspondence and paid for them to be delivered via Della's wagon. Homer's freighting operation had added a 4th wagon in October and hired a driver named Wilson, a quiet, competent man of 35 who had done freighting in Wyoming and knew what he was about. They worked alongside each other and alongside their own separate occupations, and found that the balance of it was comfortable and natural. They were not the kind of married people who required constant company. They were each capable of interior life and independent purpose, but they were also not the kind who lived parallel lives that only occasionally intersected. They intersected constantly and with pleasure, at the kitchen table in the mornings and on the porch in the evenings, And in the middle of the day, sometimes when Homer came in from the barn and found Augusta sewing at the window and stopped to show her something he had found, a particularly fine stone, a hawk feather, once a small lizard of such remarkable coloring that they both bent over it for 10 minutes before it decided they had looked long enough and departed. In February of 1879, Augusta discovered she was expecting a child. She told Homer on the evening of the day she was certain, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp lit and the winter wind making its quiet sound around the house. He looked at her across the table for a moment that was entirely still, and then his face did the thing it did when something reached past his considerable composure and made itself directly known. It simply opened, every careful layer of it giving way to something clean and bright and absolutely genuine. "Augusta," he said. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and took both her hands and held them for a long moment. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "I am better than well." He turned her hands over and looked at them, the way people sometimes look at their hands when they need a moment to contain something. When he looked up, his eyes were bright. "I am going to be a father," he said, as if the word required saying aloud to become entirely real. "You are," she said. The baby arrived in October of 1879, on a clear, cold morning when the mountains to the northwest were holding the first snow of the season on their peaks, and the sky was the particular hard blue of Nevada autumn. Doc Henshaw presided. Esperanza was there. Frances had come for the last 2 weeks of waiting, and was in the kitchen making an extraordinary quantity of food on the basis that the world was improved by the availability of food in difficult moments. The baby was a boy, dark-haired and extremely vocal, who arrived with an announcement of himself that made Doc Henshaw laugh, and filled Augusta with a love so immediate and physical it was like the desert itself. Not gradual, but simply there, enormous and total. Homer held him for the first time with the carefully calibrated attention of a man who has decided that he will do this right and is applying to it everything he has, and the baby looked up at him with the unfocused but somehow intently focused gaze of the very new, and Homer said, very quietly, "Hello, then." They named him James, for Augusta's father. James Garrett was a remarkable baby in the way that all babies are remarkable to their parents, and also in some ways that were more specific. He was curious from very early, reaching for things, watching things, with a quality of attention that made Augusta think of his father. He was robust and healthy and loud, and opinionated about milk and silence and the particular angle of the light and the company of the gray mare Patience, who bore his small, loud presence in her stall with the magnificent dignity her name implied. They had, in the way of young couples in the territory, not too much time and too much work, and an abundance of the kind of life that fills itself in with detail and meaning if you are paying attention, which they were. The freighting business continued to grow. The dressmaking business had expanded significantly by 1880, enough that Esperanza had taken on a third seamstress, a young Paiute woman named Nell who was fast and gifted, and whose integration into the work had not been without friction from certain quarters of the town, which Augusta and Esperanza had addressed directly and without apology, because Augusta had come to understand that the injustices of the territory were not abstract but particular, and that the particular required particular response. She had found, out here, that she had opinions about more things than she had realized in Cincinnati, and that she had a willingness to express them that the West, with its requirement that people be what they actually were or suffer for the performance, had drawn out of her. She was not combative by nature, but she was direct, and in Dusty Creek directness was respected as its own form of courtesy, and she found that she could advocate for what she thought was right, including for the Paiute workers who were often paid less and treated as less by people who should have known better, without it costing her the relationships that mattered. Nell stayed. She was excellent at her work, and she and Esperanza and Augusta developed the particular working ease of people who respect each other completely and argue about practical things without taking the argument home. And the business thrived in the way that businesses thrive when the people running them are genuinely good at what they do and genuinely interested in doing it well. By the spring of 1881, Dusty Creek had grown. The railroad had extended a spur line to within 8 miles of town, which changed the supply economics and brought new people and new enterprise. And Homer's freighting routes adjusted to take advantage of the new dynamics rather than resist them. Because he was, as Augusta had observed from the beginning, a man who looked at things accurately and planned from what he saw rather than from what he wished. The house north of town had acquired a kitchen garden and a small corral and a chicken house, and the spring of that year had the particular quality of abundance green shoots and bird noise and the high clear skies of Nevada in March that made Augusta, who had lived through 3 Nevada springs by then and knew what to expect, nonetheless surprised every time. James was 18 months old and in full command of his mobility, which he used to visit every corner of the property that was accessible to a person of his dimensions. He had a particular affection for the chickens, which reciprocated with a wariness that did not diminish his interest. He had his father's dark brown eyes and his mother's manner of direct assessment, and he was already showing what Homer said, with quiet pride, was the particular quality of a person who is going to have strong opinions about everything. Augusta was pregnant again by April of that year. She told Homer on the porch on a Sunday evening when James was inside being persuaded toward sleep by Frances, who was visiting for the Easter week. The air was cool, and the last of the sunset was burning itself out behind the western ridgeline, and Homer was sitting on the step with his coffee, and Augusta was in the porch chair with her feet pulled up. "Again," he said, and looked at her with that expression. "Again," she said. He set down his coffee and came up to the chair and crouched beside it and looked at her with everything he had. And she looked back at him and thought about the woman on the westbound train who had decided she was done with men, and done with love, and done with the whole project of hoping for something that kept turning out wrong. And she thought about where that woman's road had ended and what had been waiting there, and she thought that if that woman could have seen this, the porch and the fading sunset and the child inside and this man looking at her with his whole face open, she might have gotten on the train a great deal sooner. "Are you glad?" he asked. "Homer," she said, "I am so glad I cannot account for it." He covered her hand with his and they sat together as the last color left the sky, and the first stars began to show themselves over the Nevada desert, bright and absolute and clean in the dark. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1881, with red lights in her dark hair and a quieter temperament than her brother and a precise, considering gaze that was recognizably Augusta's. They named her Clara, partly for Clara Hargrove, who had brought a ham and a wool blanket and a set of opinions about child-rearing on the day of the birth, and delivered all 3 with equal confidence. James received his sister with a cautious but ultimately genuine interest, particularly once she was old enough to be interested in him in return, which happened faster than either Augusta or Homer anticipated. By Clara's first birthday, the two of them had developed a working relationship based on shared goals, which mostly involved the chickens, the horses, and the large flat rock in the back garden that served as a general-purpose stage for whatever they had decided needed performing on any given afternoon. Homer watched his children with the same open attention he gave to everything, and Augusta watched him watch them and thought, not for the first time, that she had been given something she had not known how to ask for because she had not known it existed, a love that did not require maintenance, that did not need to be managed or protected or constructed, that simply persisted in the ordinary life of work and weather and bread and horses, and 2 children with dark eyes, and the wide Nevada sky above everything. Frances married in 1882 to a schoolteacher named Edward Marsh who came out from Missouri to teach the upper grades, and who, within 6 months of arriving in Dusty Creek, had developed the same settled conviction that Augusta had developed 4 years earlier, that this was a place worth staying. He was a mild, intelligent, deeply bookish man who owned more volumes than the whole of Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house library, and who could talk to Homer about Washington, Irving for an hour without either of them growing tired of it. Augusta loved him immediately and completely on Frances's behalf. At Frances's wedding, which was in the church in March with the early spring light coming through the plain glass windows at exactly the angle the Reverend Caldwell had always said was the best, Augusta stood again at the front and held the flowers and watched her cousin walk toward the person who had been, for her, the end of whatever road she had been traveling, and she felt something she recognized as a completion. A wholeness in the story that had begun with a letter arriving at the wrong address, and had wound its way here through desert and distance, and the particular courage of beginning again. She found Homer beside her at the reception, as she always found him, not by design but by the natural gravity of people who have oriented themselves to each other's presence. He was holding James, who had gotten into an altercation with a piece of wedding cake that had left him substantially the worse for wear, and who was now asleep against his father's shoulder with the absolute abandon of a child who has used every resource available. "He fought bravely," Homer said, looking at the cake evidence on his son's face. "He always does," Augusta said. They stood together in the afternoon light of Frances's wedding reception, and Augusta thought about the road, the only road, the one that ran south from Harlow Station and curved through the canyon and came out here, to this town and this life. She thought about how she had come down that road with her leather trunk and her 37 readings of her mother's letter and her absolute certainty that she was done with love. And she thought about how the road had ended exactly here, and how what had been waiting at its end had been, against every expectation, precisely what she had not known she was looking for. She slipped her hand into Homer's free hand, the one that wasn't holding James, and he held it without looking at her, just held it in the simple automatic way of two people who have grown so completely into each other's habit that the gesture requires no thought at all. And she stood in the afternoon light of the Nevada spring and felt the weight and warmth of the life she had built in this place she had come to forget a man and found, at the end of the only road. A man who made everything she thought she knew about love into something larger than she had been capable of imagining. Outside, through the open door, the desert stretched away in every direction, as honest and absolute and full of color as it had always been, keeping everything she had given it and returning it, as it always did, transformed. James slept against his father's shoulder. Clara, in Esperanza's arms across the room, was examining a piece of ribbon with the expression of someone conducting a serious investigation. Frances was laughing at something Edward had said, her face lit with the particular light of a person who has just arrived. The piano was playing something bright, and the sound of it went out the open windows into the spring afternoon. Augusta looked at all of it, the room, the people, the life, and then she looked at Homer, who turned at that moment and found her looking and gave her that slow, genuine smile that she had first seen in a barn full of straw and golden light, and had been seeing every day since, and which had never once in all that time stopped being the truest thing in any room. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was a question she understood now in a way she had not understood it when she had first come. She had thought happiness was something you arrived at and then maintained through effort, the way you maintained a wall. She had learned out here that it was not a wall at all. It was more like the desert itself, not gentle, not managed, not constructed to accommodate you, but real and keeping what you gave it. "Yes," she said. "Homer, I am." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, briefly and simply, and they stood in the light of the Nevada spring with their sleeping son between them and their daughter across the room and their friends and family all around. And outside the desert held them as it always held everything it kept in the wide and honest and brilliant permanence of all that open space.